So, good morning, everybody.
Morning.
What one of the committees formed to discuss how the cathedral will deal with issues raised by the Black Lives Matter movement was to look at the history and context of these issues as they refer to the cathedral. The committee consisted of Anne Elborn, Peggy Simpson, and me. Anne has done extensive research and prepared a very scholarly paper on the history of slavery and racism in Quebec. Peggy has reviewed the cathedral registers going back to the founding of Christ Church, looking for entries that refer to slaves and people who were not white skinned. I have had discussions with people who attend the cathedral at present to hear about their experiences. We will now each discuss our findings, beginning with Anne, then Peggy, then me. There will be a PowerPoint presentation to accompany some of this. We ask you to please hold any comments or questions that you might have until we have finished, when there will be a question period. If you wish, you can put your questions into the chat line and they will be answered at that time. Anne?
Thank you. So we cannot know who we are without knowing who we were. Mackey wrote that outside of specialized works devoted to Black history, Blacks are largely absent from Canada's historical literature. It's not that they've been airbrushed out, they were never included to begin with. Eurocentric culture has dominated our history. That was certainly true of the history courses in schools. Here's a picture of Matthew de Costa, the first known Black in Canada. We don't actually know what he really looked like. He was Champlain's interpreter, well-educated, a baptized Christian, a member of Champlain's dining club, which was called the Order of Good Cheer. Probably he was not a slave. But the first slave that we know about was a little boy of 6 years old called Olivier, who was brought from Africa and owned by David Kirke, who was a kind of a pirate who'd taken over Quebec City in 1628. David Kirke sold him to a French clerk for 50 crowns. Then he was later on resold before he was a teenager. He was baptized by Father Paul Lejeune. And according to the Jesuit relations, he said when he was baptized, "You say that by baptism I shall be like you. I am Black, you're white. I must have my skin taken off then in order to be like you." He was freed in 1638 and died in 1654. Until 1663, New France was run by the fur traders, but in 1663, Louis XIV took over the government, which was now run by the bishop, the intendant, and the governor. In France, there was a law forbidding slavery, but slavery was very common in the French possessions in the Caribbean. So Louis XIV issues a code noir for the French possessions, but not for New France. However, in 1709, he made a decree permitting import of slaves to New France. And the same year, the intendant legalized the purchase and the possession of slaves in New France. And owning a slave at this point was prestige, but slaves themselves were sadly regarded as chattels. From 1628 to 1760, 1760 being when the British took over, approximately 1,000 Black slaves were brought to Canada from New England or the West Indies. But there were many more Pawnees, who were the indigenous slaves. Black slaves were more valuable. Trudel calculates that in this period, there were approximately 4,200 slaves, which he was able to identify and list in his Dictionnaire des Esclaves. Again, more than half of these are Pawnee. He also wrote this book, which I relied on fairly heavily for information, 2 Centuries of Slavery in Quebec. The picture on the cover here is of Marie Angelique Joseph. Again, we don't really know what she looked like. Here's another picture of her. She's probably the most famous slave. She actually does get into the history books. She was born in Portugal, owned by a French woman in Montreal. wanted her freedom, was refused her freedom, decided to run away with her lover, who was an white indentured servant. And they set a fire as they were trying to run away, which destroyed not only her owner's house, but a large part of Montreal. She was caught, found guilty, tortured, and hanged. And as the passage here comments, her story has become a symbol of freedom and resistance. This is from Trudel. It's a breakdown of the slaves by race. So you can see nearly 2/3 were Amerindians, 34% Black, and a small number were mixed Amerindians and Blacks. This map shows you where the slaves were located. So starting in Quebec, 966, moving upriver to Trois-Rivières, 43, probably working in the ironworks. Montreal, 1,524, with little pockets of slaves around the edges of Montreal. And then up in the top left-hand corner, you'll see Detroit, which at one point was part of New France. In 1760, General Wolfe defeated Montcalm at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. The British took over, and the first thing they did was to publish the Articles of Capitulation, which was intended to keep the French people peaceful by giving them all kinds of rights. This article says, the Negroes and pioneers of both sexes shall remain in their quality of slaves in the possession of the French and Canadians to whom they belong. They shall be at liberty to keep them in their service in the colony or to sell them, and they may also continue to bring them up in the Roman religion. The first governor of British Quebec was James Murray. He was very interested in owning some slaves. He writes to a friend in New York, without servants, nothing can be done, and the French Canadians will work for nobody but themselves. Therefore, I must earnestly entreat your assistance. Black slaves are certainly the only people to be depended upon. You may buy for each a clean young wife who can work and do the female offices about a farm. I shall begrudge no price. We'll see what happened to one of his slaves later. This comes from Trudel again, and the chart shows you how many slaves on his list there were at different decades. So you can see in the early years, there are very few slaves. After slavery was kind of legalized in Quebec in 1709, you see the numbers picking up. Then in the right-hand column, when the British have taken over, you see that suddenly the numbers go skyrocketing up. And that's the effect of the American Revolution, which we'll come to in a moment. So what kind of work did these slaves do? Well, first of all, they're not plantation slaves in Quebec. Mostly they were domestic servants. Some worked on the farms or in the fur trade. Some of them were skilled tradesmen. And I'm going to read you some of the ads in various newspapers. And I'm going to apologize for the fact that these ads does use the word Negro, which we don't use nowadays. But I've left it in because it reflects the vocabulary of the time. And I hope nobody's going to be upset or offended by this. An ad in the Boston Evening Post, 1751, just received from Halifax and to be sold, 10 strong, hearty Negro men, mostly tradesmen, such as caulkers, carpenters, sailmakers, and rope makers. Ad in the Quebec Gazette, 1767. A healthy Negro boy, about 15 years of age, well qualified to wait on gentlemen as a body servant. Hard to believe that this sort of scene regularly took place. And possibly the woman and her daughter are the ones referred to in this ad. A gentleman going to England has for sale a Negro wench with her child, about 26 years of age, who understands thoroughly every kind of housework, particularly washing and cookery, and a stout Negro boy, 13 years old. And then notice the juxtaposition, also a good horse, carriole, and harness. Ad in the Quebec Gazette, February 1769. Miles Prentice, tavern keeper in the lower town of Quebec, intends leaving the province. Mr. Prentice has to sell a Negro woman aged 25 years with a mulatto male child, 9 months old. She was formerly the property of General Murray. She can be well recommended for a good house servant, handles milk well, and makes butter to perfection. Likewise, a Negro man, aged 23 years, a very good house servant, understands waiting upon a gentleman and looks well in livery. Slaves that were bilingual or had had smallpox or measles were particularly valuable, so the ads often mention this fact. Quebec Gazette, 1779, to be sold by private sale. A robust, likely, healthy Negro fellow, about 21 years of age, speaks English and French well and has had the smallpox. And then in the Quebec Gazette, here's an ad for a runaway slave. There were lots of ads for runaways, which are very interesting because they give details about what the slave looked like, what his talents were, what he was wearing. This one ran away from the subscriber, a Negro man named Locanes, aged 25 years, thin-faced, remarkable long hair tied behind, speaks good French, no English, plays the violin very well. He had on a light-colored short coat with a red cape, waistcoat and breeches, $16 reward. So who were the owners? Trudel identifies 1,574 slave owners who owned 4,200 slaves. And you will see that the owners were not just individuals. There could be merchant association, religious communities, the state. The executioner in Quebec City was a slave, and so was his wife. Overall, French Canadians owned more slaves than the British Canadians, and that was true even after the conquest. During the French regime, many high officials, the bishop, the intendant, the governor, owned slaves. Murray was the only British governor to own a slave, but high-ranking British officers and rich merchants, typical members of the Cathedral congregation actually, owned slaves. Here's Trudel's breakdown of some of the professions. So you'll see the merchants, traders, bourgeoisie were the biggest category. And down at the bottom, the voyageurs, who were the fur traders, were the second biggest category. And then you have these small business owners like butchers and bakers and tavern owners who owned slaves. And then there was the church, 4 bishops who were all French. There were no English bishops on that list. The Jesuits, not all of whom actually were in Quebec at this time. Some of them were in what is now the United States. But you can see these various religious organizations, including in Montreal, down at the bottom, Maire Duville, who owned 3 or 4 slaves, hospitals, also owning slaves. Why would the religious people own slaves? Trudel wrote that in a society where slavery is sanctioned by the law, practiced by the most prominent people, generally accepted as a social factor, why wouldn't members of the church who had the same property rights not conform to the customs of their time? Sad comment. Only one Anglican priest owned a slave, and that was David DeLille, appointed Anglican garrison chaplain in 1766. Owned a slave named Charles, bought in 1780 for £20 Halifax currency. His previous owner was a rebel American captured in a raid during the Revolutionary Wars. And DeLille, of course, was one of the first priests for the what later became the Cathedral. How were slaves treated? usually within the law in Canada. Slaves in Canada were better treated than slaves in America or the West Indies. There were no boatloads of African slaves, overseers, slave drivers, whipping posts. Under the British regime, slaves had the right to habeas corpus, so they couldn't simply be put in prison and left there, and trial by jury. And interestingly, owners tended to ask the law courts to punish their slaves. Mackey gives one example. He gives several examples, actually, but this is Samuel Judah's slave, Jacob, who assaulted Judah in 1781. And he sent him off to be tried by the local court. And the court ordered the said Jacob, Negro man, to be committed to prison for the above assault until he do find security for his good behavior towards the said Samuel Judah. So it's notice Jacob is not just here regarded as property to be sort of punished severely, but he is a person with rights and obligations. 1781 is heading towards when slavery is dying out. Slaves were sometimes freed, about 100 in New France before 1760. Sometimes they're freed as a reward. Sometimes, though, the owner bequeathed them to his heirs in his will. 4/5 of slaves were baptized, mostly Roman Catholic, 223 Protestants, but these are all English because the Roman Catholics, the French Canadians were not Protestants. The owner had to give permission for marriage, and the children of slave marriages belonged to the owner. Mostly they were not educated, but many of them spoke 2 or 3 languages and had many abilities, like the slave we saw who could play the violin. As we saw on that table, the number of Black people coming to Canada increased enormously towards the end of the 18th century, and this is because of the American Revolution. The picture here shows a Black slave, one of approximately 20,000, who joined the British Army during the American Revolution. Slaves who escaped behind British lines before November the 30th, 1782, were freed, allowed to come to Canada. And the Book of Negroes, which you've probably all heard of, lists the African Americans eligible for freedom in Canada. After the war, some 40,000 loyalists emigrated. Some of them brought their Black slaves with them. 10,000 settled in Quebec. Roughly 3,500 free Blacks came to Canada. And then after the passing of the Fugitive Slaves Act, a steady stream of escaped slaves came to Canada. One of the stops on the Underground Railroad was Phillipsburg United Church in the townships. There's a lot more in history books about the Blacks in Nova Scotia and Ontario than in Quebec, so harder to find out about them. So as I said, slavery was gradually ending in the last 2 decades of the 18th century. Upper Canada actually passed an act to limit slavery, which only applied to Upper Canada, that's Ontario. Similar acts didn't pass in Quebec. There were 2 acts which didn't pass. However, a series of rather complicated legal decisions freed runaway slaves, really brought about the ending of slavery. I can tell you more about the cases, but there isn't time right here. So the value of slaves as property fell because people, you didn't know that your property was still going to be your property in a few months' time. And people's opinions were changing. The Quebec Gazette had been publishing ads for the sale of slaves, but now they begin printing anti-slavery poetry after 1790. And my favorite Anglican bishop, Charles James Stewart, the Anglican Bishop of Quebec in the 1820s, refused to take sugar in his tea because it was the product of slave labor. In 1833, the British Parliament abolished slavery in the British Empire. But it's actually more limited than one thinks. It only emancipated children under the age of 6. The others who are older were to be retained for 4 to 6 years as apprentices. but nevertheless, slavery is now illegal. However well treated, the fact remains that slavery was possible with two assumptions. One, that blacks are inferior, and two, that whites have a natural right to treat blacks as property. Mackey wrote, slavery did not end in Quebec with a ringing Emancipation Proclamation on some historic day, rather like a style of dress the fashion passed. Sadly, the notion of an inferior race persisted and resulted in discrimination. And just quickly, I'm going to through a few examples of racism in the 19th and 20th century. This was a fact I actually hadn't known, and I was shocked. Schools in Ontario and Nova Scotia were racially segregated. And look at the dates when the last segregated school was closed in Ontario and Nova Scotia. There was no racial segregation in Quebec because schools were either Catholic or Protestant. Universities have a terrible record. 1918, Queen's barred admission of Black students to medical program, claimed that the white Kingston residents did not want a Black physician. U of T denied admission to Black students in the 1920s. McGill sometimes banned, sometimes restricted Black students. 1930 to 1947, Black medical students were barred from doing their internships in Montreal hospitals, so they were sent to the Black University, Howard University in Washington, to fulfill their residency requirements. Black nurses in Montreal were only allowed to treat Black patients, and Black women were often denied admission to nursing schools. We all know that Black people often have difficulty finding housing. Black loyalists in Ontario, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia were given much worse land than the white loyalists. There are many examples in all the provinces of land titles preventing the sale or rental of property to Black people. Blacks turned away when they try to rent property, which leads to a heavy concentration of Black residents in some neighborhoods like Little Burgundy. In Little Burgundy, there were a lot of railway workers. It was home to many Blacks, like the ones in the picture here, who are sleeping car porters. This is because Blacks mostly had to work in the service sectors. They were barbers, waiters, janitors, railway workers, domestic servants. So not bad jobs, but they did have problems joining the unions and having complete equality with the white workers. In World War I, Black soldiers were segregated. On the left-hand side, there's a poster looking for Black colored men of Canada to work in this construction battalion. They're not fighting, they're building trenches and things like that. On the right-hand side, a colored battalion, and I think in the middle, the officers there are white, not colored. We all have heard of Jackie Robinson, who broke a color bar when he played for the Montreal Royals. What I didn't know that the color bar goes all the way back to 1868, when the National Association of Baseball Players barred any club composed of one or more colored persons. Theatre's shocking to know that this happened in Montreal. And this I found particularly shocking, horrible. In Montreal, the Loews Windsor Theatre confined Black patrons to the upper balcony of the Opera House, which was called the Monkey Cage. Unbelievable. In Windsor, Ontario, the Pace Theatre had a crow's nest, which is a reference to the US Jim Crow laws. Restaurants and hotels routinely didn't serve Black people. In 1941, one hotel in Montreal where a Black person could stay. 1948 to 1967, there were Canadian entries for the American Green Book, the guide for Black travelers. And then there was this famous Christie case in 1936, which actually is quite complicated, but I'm going to have to simplify it here for time's sake. Fred Christie was born in the West Indies, emigrated to Canada, was a chauffeur in Montreal, had season tickets for hockey games in the Forum and also tried to go to a boxing match there. After the boxing match, he and a couple of friends were refused. They tried to buy a beer and they were refused service. He sued for $200. He won in the provincial court, but is only awarded $25. The town owners successfully appealed. So Christie took his case to the Supreme Court of Canada in 1939, who dismissed his case, arguing private businesses were able to discriminate based on race. This is a picture of Fred Christie, and at the left, clippings from the newspapers, and at the right is the what was entered into the court for the trial. Part of the problem was that he had been served beer when he went to hockey games. The problem was people were afraid of racial violence after boxing matches. So he'd been to a boxing match. Discrimination finally became illegal in the Quebec Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms, 1975, and again in the 1982 Canadian Charter of Rights. And at the bottom, there's a extract from the Canadian Charter of Rights, saying every individual is equal before and under the law, has the right of equal protection without discrimination based on race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, mental or physical disability. So what was the church doing in all this? Well, in the 18th century, the church was the only social organization slaves were allowed to join, and they did join in very large numbers. The Black loyalists brought their churches with them, mostly Baptists or Methodists. So there were quite a lot of Baptists and Methodists, Black congregations in Montreal. Later, West Indian immigrants tended to be Anglicans. Churches were very important social centers. And if you Google the story of the Union United Church of Montreal, you'll see that this was quite an inspiring place. It was founded by a group of railway porters and was the home of many Black organizations, source of social support. And it's actually the church where Oscar Peterson worshipped. So it's worth looking that up, reading about it. So to conclude, just 2 slides here. First is the United Nations slamming Canada. It's their working group on peoples of African descent. Canada's history of enslavement, racial segregation, and marginalization of African Canadians has left a legacy of anti-Black racism and had a deleterious impact on people of African descent, which must be addressed in partnership with the affected communities. Across Canada, many people of African descent continue to live in poverty and poor health, have low educational attainment, and are overrepresented at all levels of the criminal justice system. I'm sorry, I realized I've missed the slide on immigration. Just to mention quickly that immigration policies have always set quotas and preferences for different people being allowed to emigrate to Canada. So Blacks, Chinese, Jews. You can read that bottom paragraph to yourself. I don't think I want to read it out loud because it is so disgusting. So to our conclusion, we're left with the challenge that African Canadians have a long history of self-help, of rising to the many challenges they faced integrating into society. It's our challenge as a Christian community to find a way to support our fellow Canadians and bring an end to racist attitudes which still persist. So that's the end of my presentation. I apologize for the length. And hand you over to Peggy. And
you're mute. Peggy, you're mute.
And are you going to put my slides up? Because I don't have share facilities and you have my slides.
Yeah, I have just put it up.
I don't see them.
Oh, I do.
You
Does
need to share
anybody-
your screen. You need to share them.
You need to share that screen also.
Oh, did that stop? Sorry, I thought I was still sharing.
Green button.
Yeah, can't see it. Got it.
Got it?
There you go.
Yeah, and wrong one. Oh, there we go.
Okay, it's coming.
Okay, that's the last one. Could you go up to the first one, please?
Yeah.
There we go. Okay, my job was to crawl through the church records going back to the 1760s, looking for evidence of slave owners and slaves connected to the cathedral. The result, in its sort of grossest form, was this table, which gives you the family name of slave owners I could find in church records, with evidence that they owned slaves, and how many they owned. And I'll explain what is right and wrong about it. It gives you a fairly broad idea that there were indeed slave owners in the congregation, but there are severe limitations to this table. One is that up until 1792, everyone who wasn't Catholic had their burials and marriages, baptisms if there were any, recorded at the Christ Church, because we were the only Protestant church in town and we kept all the civil records for everybody who wasn't Catholic. So for instance, the Levi Solomon's family was pretty surely Jewish. There were no baptismal records for them, but one of their children's burials is recorded in the CCC registers. Much of my data comes from Trudel. Besides his history that Anne cited, there was the Dictionary of Slaves, which listed all the slaves by name. It's heartbreaking at the beginning of each list, both the pannies and the black slaves. There are pages and pages of anonymous. The only thing we know is that someone bought one of these people or buried one of these people or baptized one of these people. No names. It's quite heartbreaking to see. They also listed lots and lots of names, and they listed the owners by region. So I could go into that for Montreal and pick out the English people, English sounding names after 1760. And then I looked for those families in the church registers and found about 22 of them. And they owned between them 58 slaves, 10 of whom were Amerindians, and the rest of whom were listed as black or mulatto. There's double counting in the list. I know of at least one. John Turner sold a slave to his brother George. So Manuel the slave was counted in each man's tally. So you can probably subtract one. Also, the other problems we found, there were people that Trudel didn't find. For instance, the famed David DeLille and his slave Charles are not in the Trudel list of slaves and owners, though they are well documented from a Canadian government document. Most of the owners in the table, 15 of them, owned one slave. 3 of them owned 3 slaves, 2 owned 4 slaves, 1 owned 6, and Captain Campbell had 20. So for most people, there weren't that many slaves, but the average is kind of slanted by Mr. Campbell. Could you turn to the next slide, Anne, please? This is a picture of an entry in the register of Christ Cathedral. In 1785, Francis and Jenny, also known as Jane, were slaves to Colonel Campbell, who were married at his request, which is an odd way to put it. But if you look at the next slide, which is Colonel Campbell's list of slaves, you'll notice Jean-Francois, who was called Francis, was married to Jeanne, also known as Jane or Jenny, fathered children by her, fathered another child with a Panese slave who belonged to Campbell, and 2 other children by another slave of Campbell's. And farther down the list, there's another marriage of Francois Javier and Marie, who produced children who were automatically slaves of Campbell's. Campbell was interesting. I think one of the reasons perhaps he had so many slaves was that he married into a French-Canadian family who had a lot of slaves. The Lecornes, his wife's brother Luke had 25 slaves, and he had 4 brothers who also had slaves, though not so many. So I wonder if that's why Campbell was so enthusiastic about holding slaves. Once he married his Catholic wife, there were no more entries that were Campbell's in our records until John was buried in the late 1700s. The other records came from Trudel, and they were baptized in Catholic churches or married there after Francis and Jenny. Could I have the next slide, Anne? George Byrne married his wife Sarah in the cathedral in 1787. There's reason to believe that this is the same George Byrne who was the hangman in Quebec City. He was Anglican according to his burial record, so he's probably our man. Next, please. Another marriage of slaves in the upper entry in 1786. Thomas and Margaret were married by leave of their respective owners. So it's interesting, they came, contrary to Campbell's experience, they came from 2 different households, presumably, and asked to be married. It's not entirely sure whether Campbell's slaves asked or were told. Many of the people in this, I found about 65, 66 names of people identified as Pawnee or Black in this cathedral records. Many of them were probably not slaves. So in the lower entry here, we have Alan Manderville, a Black man, waiter at Sullivan's Tavern, or Coffee House, sorry, and his wife. And there's no mention of there being slaves, and quite possibly they weren't. This happened in 1799 as things were slowing down and many free Blacks had entered Quebec. So in summary, there are some other things I should mention, though I didn't take pictures of them. There are a lot of baptismal records, including an adult Pawnee, 13, property of William Josiah Bleakley, merchant of the city of Montreal, was baptized on November 17th, 1799, as were Blakely's infant daughter and an infant daughter of Simon McTavish, which is just kind of an interesting tableau that these 3 people were baptized in the church on the same day, presumably at the same time. By the time you get past the late 1790s, there are no more, very few people are named as slaves in the records, but if their names were in Trudel, maybe. But there are a lot of others who were probably free. They bought property and did other things that seemed to set them off as having a free life. One man in particular was listed several times at his baptism and his marriage, for instance, and the birth of his child as a Black man. And when his child died and was buried at the cathedral, he was just listed as a laborer. So it's not entirely sure what happened in the cathedral. I think as time went on, maybe we had the grace to just list people as people. Again, you can't really tell from what's written. The records in the cathedral archives are very bare. You get married, they give your name and your wife's name. You die, they say you were buried. You get baptized, they say you were baptized. There's very little else. Sometimes you get godparents, but in the early records, not even, or parents' names sometimes. So in summary, what we found was there were indeed a fair number of families who owned slaves. They came to the cathedral, the families came to the cathedral, they were married, buried, baptized, their kids were baptized, their grandkids were baptized. So many of the people whose names you see on that first list were practicing Anglicans, espousing the doctrines and the words we all say, even today. So it's a little sobering to think that our church did indeed have a history of involvement with slavery. And I hope that our current undertaking will help to erase the long shadows of that practice among us. Bob.
Yep. Several people who regularly attend the cathedral these days, either in person or online, were asked about their personal experiences at the cathedral. They are all Black adults, young and old, and of different genders. They all attend the 10:30 service. We tried several times to reach out to members of the 9 o'clock community, but received no response. One person interviewed did relate an experience which appears to have a racist basis that occurred about 60 years ago. When that person first appeared at the cathedral, the dean suggested that a Black church might be more appropriate. The suggestion was refused, and other people were much more welcoming. There were some comments that in the past, some people, particularly British people, but not the present dean, have appeared to be a bit condescending. However, it's not clear that this is a racist attitude. It may just have been a form of snobism. Generally, however, although they have experienced racism and racial discrimination in society in general, all of them always feel very welcome at the cathedral and comfortable with all members of the community. One area where some racism was reported is in the attitude of some staff towards Indigenous people who might cause trouble because of problems with alcohol and drugs. So I found that very, I was going to say comforting. That's not the right word, but I'm quite convinced that racism does not seem to appear nowadays, in our community.